Leviticus Chapter 15. The Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying, Speak to the children of Israel and tell them, when a man has a discharge from his body, his discharge makes him unclean. This is the nature of his uncleanness due to his discharge. Whether his body allows the discharge to flow or becomes blocked, he is unclean. Every bed on which he lies while having the discharge is unclean, and everything on which he sits becomes unclean. Whoever touches his bed must wash his clothes and bathe in water. He remains unclean until evening. Whoever sits on anything on which the one with the discharge has sat must wash his clothes and bathe in water. He remains unclean until evening. Whoever touches the body of the one with the discharge must wash his clothes and bathe in water. He remains unclean until evening. If the one with the discharge spits on someone who is clean, that person must wash his clothes and bathe in water. He remains unclean until evening. Every saddle the one with the discharge rides upon becomes unclean. Whoever touches anything that was under the one with the discharge must wash his clothes and bathe in water. He remains unclean until evening. If the one with the discharge touches someone without first rinsing his hands in water, that person must wash his clothes and bathe in water. He remains unclean until evening. Any clay pot the one with the discharge touches must be broken, while any wooden utensil must be rinsed with water. When the one with the discharge becomes clean from his discharge, he is to count off 7 days for his cleansing. Then he must wash his clothes and bathe in fresh water, and he will be clean. On the 8th day, he must take 2 turtledoves or 2 young pigeons and come before the Lord to the entrance of the tent of meeting and give them to the priest. The priest shall offer one for a sin offering and the other for a burnt offering, and the priest shall make atonement for him before the Lord for his discharge. If a man has a seminal emission, he must bathe his whole body in water, and be unclean until evening. Any clothing or leather on which there is seminal emission must be washed with water, and be unclean until evening. When a woman lies with a man, she is unclean because of the flow of her menstrual blood. For 7 days she is to be set apart, and anyone who touches her will be unclean until evening. Everything on which she lies during her menstrual period will be unclean, and everything on which she sits will be unclean. Whoever touches her bed must wash his clothes and bathe in water. He remains unclean until evening. Whoever touches any object she has sat on must wash his clothes and bathe in water. He remains unclean until evening. If her menstrual flow touches a man, he will be unclean for 7 days, and every bed he lies on will become unclean. When a woman has a discharge of her blood for many days other than her regular menstrual period, or if it continues beyond the time of her regular period, all the days of her discharge will be as days of her unclean discharge. She will be unclean. Every bed she lies on during her discharge and everything she sits on will be unclean, as in her menstrual period. Whoever touches those things will be unclean. He must wash his clothes and bathe in water. He will be unclean until evening. If she becomes clean from her discharge, she must count off 7 days, and afterward she will be clean. On the 8th day, she must take 2 turtledoves or 2 young pigeons and bring them to the priest at the entrance of the tent of meeting. The priest shall offer one for a sin offering and the other for a burnt offering, and the priest shall make atonement for her before the Lord for the discharge of her uncleanness. This is how you are to separate the Israelites from their uncleanness, so they do not die in their uncleanness by defiling my tabernacle that is among them. These are the laws concerning a man with a discharge, a man who has an emission of semen, and a woman who is unclean because of her menstrual period, whether a man or a woman, and a man who lies with an unclean woman.